Hello and welcome. You've tuned into Estimating Marginal Cost for Cost-Benefit Analysis in Criminal Justice. I'm Chris Henrichson, and I'm here today with my Vera Institute colleague, Valerie Levshin. This webinar is a component of the Cost-Benefit Knowledge Bank for Criminal Justice, which is a project of the Vera Institute and is funded by the U.S. Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Assistance. All of our work for CBKB is housed on our website, cbkb.org. In addition to these webinars, we will feature in the coming months a CBA toolkit that will teach you how to do cost-benefit, as well as snapshots that provide us information as to what the literature tells us about criminal justice from the cost-benefit literature. Additionally, you'll find on the website podcasts, videocasts, and webinars such as this. And later on in the year, we'll be posting publications coming out of two roundtable discussions we've had in the past few months. One roundtable discussion was on building cost-benefit capacity in your state, and another roundtable discussion was on cost-effective policing. I'll spend a few more minutes wrapping up housekeeping and introductions, and then before we dive into marginal costs, I'm going to provide an overview of cost-benefit analysis. There, we're going to take it on to understanding marginal costs, where Valerie will start walking you through the differences between marginal costs and average costs. Then, we'll spend most of our time talking about how to estimate marginal costs. In this webinar, we'll talk about 5 ways in particular that you can use to estimate marginal costs. At the end, there'll be a wrap-up and a short survey. You'll notice on the left side of your window, there's a chat feature. Please use this throughout the webinar to ask us questions, and during the question periods, we'll take the time to answer anything you may have asked us during the previous segment. You'll note that the chat feature is on the left side, but you can maximize the slide so that it falls out of view. So if you wish to ask a question, you'll need to minimize the viewing pane for the webinar itself. Please call 1-800-843-9166 if you have any problems with ReadyTalk, or you can email technical support at help@readytalk.com. You'll notice that there's 3 handouts that have been provided to you in the email confirmation and are also provided on the blog that houses the webinar recording. And also, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to cbkb.org with this and any other webinars that we have done in the past. Today you will learn the difference between marginal costs and average costs, and why marginal costs are necessary in a credible cost-benefit analysis, as well as 5 methods that you can use to estimate the marginal costs of criminal justice operations. Before we get into the details of marginal costs, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about cost-benefit analysis more broadly. First and foremost, cost-benefit analysis is a tool that assesses the pros and cons in various programs and policies. And it goes beyond budget analysis and fiscal impact statements that take a look at the impact of the policy program to the government budget, to the taxpayer, but goes beyond that to consider what is the greatest net benefit to society. And here at Vera, we think of cost-benefit analysis as an approach to policymaking that's an objective playing field to lay out all the costs and benefits associated with various decisions. The key feature of a CBA is that you monetize both costs and also the benefits. And you measure these benefits and costs over a long-term planning horizon, looking far beyond the 1 or 2 year budget cycle. Future costs and benefits are discounted down to the present to acknowledge the fact that today's dollars are worth more than future dollars. That is the time value of money. And another key feature of cost-benefit is that we include both the tangible and intangible costs and benefits of policies and programs. The tangible benefit, of course, being the more obviously monetizable benefits such as earnings, employment, and tangible losses due to victimization such as burglaries or maybe hospital bills. Less tangible benefits or costs that we monetize, for example, are, say, the pain and suffering associated with victimization. We won't get into the monetization of intangible benefits, and that will be a feature of upcoming work in March, which will be a month in which we'll be featuring victimization and the victimization literature. There are 5 steps in our view, in our practice, to conducting a cost-benefit analysis. First, you need to determine the impact of the initiative. Without research that tells you what will happen or what is very likely to happen, either based on an evaluation of the policy program that's being studied or very close comparison, there's no way to know what the costs and benefits will ensue in the future. Secondly, you need to determine whose perspective matters. In addition to the government and the taxpayer, you need to look at to whom the benefits and costs will accrue on account of that policy or program. Then you need to measure the costs. These are typically taxpayer or governmental costs. then the benefits that accrue are typically benefits to society, benefits that fall outside of the budget. But oftentimes there are taxpayer benefits which can very easily be monetized in dollars. Then you compare the costs and benefits, discounting future costs and benefits to the future. When measuring costs and measuring benefits, there's two aspects of the calculation. You need to measure the quantity of the change times the unit cost or the unit benefit for that given level of change. And this is what we're going to be talking about today, because the accuracy of these unit costs affect the accuracy of the cost-benefit results. And before we dive into some of the details, I'm going to take a little bit of time to mention how this can be contextualized with respect to some things we see every day in the paper. Now, it's often mentioned that incarceration is very expensive. And in California, it costs more than $44,000 a year to incarcerate a prisoner. And then this reporter goes on to note that for the same price, you could send someone to Harvard for a year with room and board. And although it's not stated explicitly, the subtext is generally and very frequently that if there's one fewer person in prison, that funding could afford one more person to go to Harvard. Now, it's absolutely true that the average cost of incarceration and the average cost of Harvard are about the same. But it is not at all true that the savings generated from one prison population decline, one inmate fewer, would be sufficient to send one person to Harvard. And the reason for this is highlighted in another recent press article. In Massachusetts, it similarly costs about $46,000 a year to house an inmate. But there's much more to this figure than people might realize. And as is stated in this article, it only costs about $9,000 per year per inmate to cover items like food and clothing and other incidentals. And this is the very essence of the concept of marginal costs. When you change workload by a very small margin, a very small amount, you are only going to incur very small benefits or savings. However, as that unit increment increases, you save more and more. Now this is a question, this is an area that we have blocked out for some questions. We're only a few minutes into it, and I see that there aren't many questions at this point that relate to this segment. There's a couple more that relate to some more detailed questions regarding marginal cost that will be discussed in this following slides, so I'll leave those to later. And now I'll hand it over to Valerie.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes talking a little bit more about the role of marginal costs in cost-benefit analysis, what marginal costs are, and how to estimate them. So when we do a cost-benefit analysis of our criminal justice initiative, we're looking often at programs and policies that generate some costs and sometimes cost savings. So for example, if a corrections department wants to expand a reentry program that decreases recidivism rates, the key policy question is how much will it cost to have this expansion, and how much will the program save down the line if it reduces recidivism rates and ultimately criminal justice expenditures. So to answer these questions and to accurately estimate these costs and cost savings, we have to use marginal costs of government operations. So what are marginal costs? Marginal costs describe how the cost of an operation changes when workload changes by a small amount. So marginal in this case doesn't mean unimportant. It just means incremental or associated with a small change. It's a term that's borrowed from economics. Now, when we talk about marginal costs, we're contrasting them with average costs, which typically include both marginal and fixed costs. And fixed costs are costs that don't really change as workload changes. So the average cost is that $46,000 that Chris mentioned earlier, and it's usually calculated by dividing the total budget by total workload. So in the example of a corrections department, it would be dividing the total budget for Department of Corrections by a total number of inmates. This is the cost that's frequently cited as the cost of incarceration, the average cost of incarcerating one inmate. So let me illustrate this with an example. So for example, if you have a 1,000-bed prison that has about 900 inmates, imagine a new program and policy is introduced that decreases the inmate population from 900 to 850. Now, the prison system might save on some costs, like cost of food, clothing, medical expenses. Those are marginal costs that change with a small change in a workload. But the prison system is not going to save on electricity, on building maintenance, on warden salary. Those are fixed costs. So the average cost for that prison might be $46,000, but this cost includes both the marginal costs, like food and clothing, and the fixed costs, like electricity, which don't change with changes in the workload. So the small reduction in inmate population is not going to save the whole $46,000 per inmate. So the key takeaway here is that when policies and programs change workload on a margin or by a small amount, using average instead of marginal cost is going to overstate the costs and the cost savings. Now, here's another concept we wanted to introduce, step fixed costs. So for example, if the inmate population decreases from 900 to 700, now what will the impact be then? Because this is a more significant reduction. It's a reduction of 200 inmates. Then we have to add step fixed costs to those marginal costs to determine the long-term marginal costs. And step fixed costs describe how the cost of an operation changes with a significant change in activity. So for example, for every additional 200 inmates, you may have to hire additional correctional officers. Or if you have an employment program for additional 50 participants, you may have to build a new classroom or hire new instructors. So I went through a lot of different costs, and let me illustrate that with a larger example. So for example, if you have a prison, you have here an illustration of a prison that has multiple housing areas. We have here just 3 housing areas, but this is just an example. Presumably, a prison will have many more. So each housing area has 20 inmates, and those 20 inmates are supervised by 2 correctional guards, and you have a warden. So imagine a new program or a policy, reduced crime in the area, and there are fewer inmates, and the inmate population decreases by 5 inmates. So one of the housing areas now has 15 inmates instead of 20. So that prison system will be able to save on food, clothing, some of the costs that are directly associated with those 5 inmates. But they would still have to pay the warden's salary and the salary of those 2 guards that still have to supervise the remaining 15 inmates. So in this case, the prison system will save on those marginal costs of food and clothing. They will be maybe around $5,000. But they would not save on those fixed costs like salaries of guards and the warden. Now, imagine that the policy had a more significant impact on the inmate population, and the prison now has 20 fewer inmates. Now the prison will be able to save not only on the food and clothing and those kind of marginal costs of those inmates, but also on the correctional officer's salaries. So now here's where we would look at long-term marginal costs, and that might be more than $5,000, maybe 10 or 15 or even 20,000. So this is where we look at long-term marginal costs. Now imagine a different scenario where the inmate population across state decreased significantly and this whole prison could be eliminated. So now all the expenses of running this prison, including food and clothing expenses and correctional officer salaries and even the warden's salaries, all those expenses could be eliminated. Here's where we can use the average cost. But the only thing to keep in mind here is that even this average cost would be less than the average cost of the whole corrections department for the state, because even if this one prison is eliminated, the state would still have to pay the salary of the commissioner of Department of Corrections and maintain the costs of operating the central office. So we covered a lot of different kinds of costs. Which costs should you use in your cost-benefit analysis? And the answer really depends on the magnitude of the impact that your policy or program will have. Is it reducing the inmate population just by a few inmates? Is it going to enable the prison system to close an entire prison or just a prison wing? Are you building a new prison, or are you starting a completely new reentry program? Depending what the impact is, that's when you decide whether to use marginal, long-term marginal, average costs. So we now approach the Q&A session, and let's see if we have any questions.
Yeah, a couple questions have come in over the chat that relate very closely to what Valerie was talking about earlier. And one is, why not use the term variable costs rather than marginal to describe those units such as food and health benefits, etc. And this is a very correct. This very correctly is a way to characterize food and health benefits. They are very much variable. They vary for each unit. The reason we don't is because the marginal cost doesn't always include just those variable costs. As Valerie was saying, you will eventually dip into those more fixed costs if your policy or program has a larger impact on workload. So that's an excellent question. It's really because the marginal cost is intended to capture all those costs which are related to the policy change. And so if you have a policy change which will only change workload by a very small amount, then the marginal cost you will use will probably be more along the lines of that variable cost. If your policy change will have a much larger impact on workload, you can then dip into those step fixed costs that Valerie is speaking to, or maybe even approach the average cost, that average with an asterisk, as Valerie was saying, as your marginal cost.
We have another interesting question. The question is, in calculating the marginal cost, don't you need to take into account the cost of the alternative? That's a really good question, and that's absolutely the case. So if we are looking at a particular new program that would be in place of another program, or for example, incarceration in place of probation, or vice versa, in calculating that additional marginal cost, you would have to subtract the cost of the alternative. So that's an excellent question. Another person is inquiring whether we would also have to take into account the cost to victims, quality of life in the neighborhood, cost to prosecutions, all the other costs. That's absolutely true. Crime does impose costs on victims and the larger community. However, today's webinar is focused on marginal costs of criminal justice operations. And in future webinars, we will try to address the cost to victims and other stakeholders. Chris, do we have any questions?
I think we have one more that relates to this topic before we get on to estimating marginal costs. And that question is, how do you account for policy that might impact the marginal costs, but also subsequently increase other fixed costs due to the added burden or restrictions of more certification standards or greater licensing requirements? And this is a great point because we spent a lot of time in the past few minutes talking about, frankly, marginal benefits, taxpayer savings, or reductions in populations. But to the extent that the policy or program will not only affect costs on a per unit basis for those additional participants, but if there's new fixed costs, if you will, that are related to that policy or program change, then you absolutely need to include that into the marginal cost calculation. So that's a great question. So I'm going to move on to estimating marginal costs. As we discussed at the outset, we're going to talk about 5 approaches to measuring marginal costs, and we start with probably the most straightforward. This list kind of goes down the line to the more complex, but that is not to say that the more complex is necessarily any better. In fact, this first approach that we'll discuss, talking with government agencies, is in our view probably the best approach. And to the extent you consider any of the other approaches, if you have access to government agencies, we encourage you to work with your government partners to ensure that the costs that you're using are recognizable to them. So we feel the first step, and this particularly to our friends on the call that work within government, is to work with government state or local budget offices or the fiscal departments within criminal justice agencies to obtain these marginal costs. And very often it's as simple as asking them if they have the marginal, or as budget people often refer to them, the incremental costs associated with a unit change, whether it's an increase or decrease in workload or population. Or to further clarify, how would a change in the MA population or the parolee population, based on this anticipated change that I have, a 5% or 10% increase or decrease, how would this affect agency funding? And if you bring this question to them in very concrete terms, they'll be able to provide you an answer. To provide some further context, we have a spreadsheet here that illustrates the type of information that might be obtained from what I want to stress is a hypothetical jail. These are sample numbers. They should not be used in analysis, but they're merely illustrative to provide some context to this discussion. Please also note that your handouts, page 2, I believe, provides further detail if you'd like to take a look at how this might look like if it were actually sort of the more fully formed document you would find in a budget office. So as Valerie was discussing earlier, the marginal cost really depends on the policy impact that is anticipated. If you're thinking about 1 to 100 inmate change, or a larger change of 101 to 600, or possibly a greater change, 600 plus, that obviously has an impact on what marginal cost will be. So for those smaller inmate population changes, you're only dealing with those variable costs, supplies and materials. But as you dip into a larger change in workload, then you get to the situation where you may be able to save on correctional personnel as well as supplies and materials. And once you get to an even greater change in the inmate population, you begin to approach those average costs, that average with an asterisk, because we're not including a lot of the overhead. And then that's at the point where you can begin to think about changes in the supervisory structure for the direct line supervision of, in this case, inmates. The pro is that this estimate likely reflects actual spending patterns. And as we've been discussing, this is really the best way to go. The downside is that not everyone on this call has access to government agencies, or particularly government budget offices. And even in some cases when you're talking about anticipated changes, it might be within areas of workloads that do not have readily available marginal cost estimates. So bringing you on to option number 2, and this is an option that might be more relevant to people that don't work within government, but instead wish to use publicly available government documents to identify marginal costs on their own. This method is a little less precise in that you are using publicly available information to build or develop a marginal cost based on a variety of assumptions. So the marginal cost that you derive is only as good as the assumptions that you have. So we're going to continue our discussion of a hypothetical marginal cost in a prison. And the easiest way to think about it is most work is very workload driven. And whether it's parole or probation or corrections, there's typically a number of staff per a number of inmates. And say in this hypothetical situation, we have 2.5 inmates per one staff member. And this needn't be just the direct line staff. This could include all staffing, right? And so this information can be obtained by budget documents, by taking a look at how much staff work in a given area, say parole, and that can be divided by, the number of inmates can be divided by this number to derive at how many parolees or inmates are handled by a given level of staffing. And this brings you to the staffing ratio. You then know how many staff are required for the given population. Then the next variable you need to fill in is the annual salary. And this annual salary here of $29,000 is the average salary of a corrections officer in North Carolina. And this information was obtained from the website sunshinereview.org. You'll see in the handouts, I believe it's handout page number 3, has a screenshot of this website that shows you the list of correctional salaries in the state of North Carolina. Now, if you take this figure of $29,000 and multiply it by the staffing ratio of 0.4, you'll get a personnel cost per inmate of $11,600. As we've been discussing, the costs of incarceration go beyond just staffing. There's also those variable costs of supplies and materials that need to be added into the equation. In this case, we were very upfront about it. This is simply an estimate or a guesstimate. This figure of $7,000 is quite close to the number that we used as an example from that Massachusetts newspaper article of $9,000. If you didn't have any other better data, that in and of itself, that newspaper article could provide some information as to what the supply and material cost per inmate would be. Now here is where the bottom line is, the marginal cost. And this is something along the medium-term marginal costs of dealing with reduction of correctional staff. So this doesn't dip into those larger fixed costs of supervisory structure, since the inmate staff here, this is the total number of correctional officers per inmate. It doesn't include the supervisory structure and doesn't include the overhead structure. So there's a couple obvious advantages to this approach. The first is that budget documents are usually readily available, and foremost among this is that salaries are not secrets. As you can see here on the screen and from your handout, you can get very detailed information on salary, and really in any state there is a vast movement on budget transparency and public accountability. This salary information is publicly available, and there's a variety of organizations across the country that aggregate this information for public consumption. And the website sunshinereview.org provides links to these state organizations that provide this information. There is a downside to this, and the downside is that you're making a lot of estimations, and oftentimes a lot of guesstimates. As in the previous slide, we didn't really know what the supply material cost is. We guessed. Oftentimes, you may not have perfect information on staffing ratios, or you may be inferring staffing ratios by looking at headcount and inmate populations. And there may be a lot of detail or a lot to read in between the lines that you're missing. So although this is not a perfect option, it is a very good option to get at the cost, the marginal cost, in contrast with the average cost. Number 3 is another similar option in that it builds off public documents that are produced by the government with respect to budget changes and workload changes. And this is actually one of our preferred methods because it allows us to look at what has already happened or is proposed to happen to take a look at what those government entities propose the savings to be. So for example, in this case, the New York State budget says that we project the parolee population to decline by 1,500, and therefore fewer parole officers are needed. So this is that whole workload issue we're talking about. And they say, therefore, there will be savings of $3.7 million. And so $3.7 million divided by the workload change of 1,500 gives you a total cost or savings per parolee of about $2,500. And so here we can infer from this budget message that there is a workload relationship between how much we spend and what we get for our dollars. And that is, for every parolee, whether it's a new parolee or reduction in parolees, it's cost $2,500. Now, the upside of this is that the actual savings, the actual costs, is based on past experience. So it's a very good way to get at what the savings are likely to be, particularly if you're trying to make a persuasive argument to budget staff or to people who are particularly interested in budget savings. The downside to this approach is that previous budget reductions, previous savings may represent unique situations that may not occur in the future. And the most obvious and concrete example of this is that, say, if a capacity reduction involved the closure of a very outdated facility that was very expensive to maintain, that these savings may not be indicative of savings in newer prisons because there was very high overhead or maintenance expenses associated with this reduction. And since budgets, any entity oftentimes takes reductions or savings in those areas which are most costly to maintain, there will be very oftentimes an inherent bias towards taking savings in the least efficient areas of the system. So although the workload, the personnel side of the equation may be very accurate, the side of the equation that relates to maintenance or to overhead may be a little bit skewed high. And so this must be taken into consideration when looking at capacity reductions or capacity increases as a way to get the marginal cost. But all other things equal, we think this is one of the preferred ways to get marginal cost information. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Valerie to walk you through a couple more options.
Hello again. So the next approach I wanted to discuss is simply using estimates from other states or organizations. A number of academic institutions and government agencies have estimated marginal costs for their analyses. So it's possible to use those costs for your jurisdiction as well. The trick here is that criminal justice expenditures vary across time and across space. So for example, just about anything is going to be more expensive in California than in Wisconsin. So it's important to address that in your analysis. And you can do that with a couple of resources. So for example, you can use the Consumer Price Index that's published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics to adjust for the difference in costs across states. You can use the inflation calculator, which I believe is also published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, to adjust for inflation if the marginal cost estimates that you have are from prior years. Another approach is to determine the marginal cost to average cost ratio in another state and then apply that ratio to determine the marginal cost in your state. And I'm going to illustrate that last approach with an example. So we recently actually had to estimate the marginal cost of policing in North Carolina. So what we did was rely on research that was developed by the Washington State for Institute of Public Policy. So you have here on the screen a table that shows marginal costs for different parts of the criminal justice system in Washington and by different offenses. And that that table should also appear in the handout number 3. So as you can see on the table, the marginal cost of policing in Washington is $670 per arrest. So we also know from Washington's research that average cost of policing in Washington is about $4,000. So we use those two numbers to estimate the ratio of marginal to average cost in Washington. So 670 divided by 4,000 is about 16%. So marginal cost in Washington is about 16% of the average cost. Next, we calculated the average cost of policing in North Carolina using national data. And we use data that's published by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. It's called Employment and Expenditures Extracts. And we essentially divided that calculated that by dividing total police expenditures by total arrests. This is typically how average costs are calculated, total expenditures by total workload. So we calculated that the average cost of policing in North Carolina is about $3,000. And next, we applied that 16% to the $3,000 to calculate the marginal cost of policing in North Carolina was about $500. So the advantage of using this approach is that information is generally available. So with a little bit of time and effort, you could do a little bit of research and find marginal costs and use other marginal costs developed by the Washington Institute, other institutions, other agencies in other states. The trick here, of course, is to make sure that the estimates that you develop are applicable in your jurisdiction. The next and final approach we wanted to discuss is using regression analysis. And we're not going to discuss this approach in too much detail in this webinar, but in a few words, essentially it's a technique that's used to understand how changes in one variable affect another variable of interest. So we can use historical spending and population data or workload data to estimate how changes in workload affect changes in expenditures, which is essentially almost the definition of marginal cost. What's the impact of change in workload on expenditures? And the Washington Institute actually uses this approach to calculate all of their marginal costs. So for example, they look at arrest data for a long period of time, say 10, 15 years. Then they combine that with expenditures data for the same period of time. And based on that information, they figure out, okay, based on how policing, how number of arrests have changed or increased over time, what impact has that had on criminal justice expenditures? And the underlying assumption here is that if a number of arrests increased again in the future, here is how expenditures would increase or decrease. So the advantage here of using this approach is that it reflects it's using actual spending and workload data. So the marginal costs reflect actual spending and workload information. The disadvantage is that to do regression analysis, you have to have cost and workload data over a relatively lengthy period of time, maybe 10, 15 years. And that information is not always readily accessible. The other trick is that sometimes expenditures change for reasons other than workload changes. So for example, in the case of policing, policing costs may increase due to increasing costs or increasing investment in information technology or counterterrorism efforts, not because of increase in crime or arrests. So it's just something to keep in mind if you do choose that approach. So we've covered quite a few different estimation methods, and a quick recap. The first one was to ask government agencies, and if you work for a government agency or if you have a good relationship with government agencies, this is probably the easiest approach to take. Next, we discussed reviewing budget and workload documents, and again, with a little bit of time and effort, you could find publicly available documents on the websites of criminal justice agencies or budget offices and use information about workload and about expenditures to figure out what the marginal costs are, what the fixed costs are. You can consider capacity reductions and figure out what the cost savings were with recent capacity reductions. You can use estimates from other organizations or states as long as you adjust those estimates for your time period and for your jurisdiction. And you can conduct regression analysis if you do have staff with expertise in statistics and regression analysis. A couple of key takeaways we really wanted to leave you with is that marginal costs represent a more accurate measure of costs and cost savings associated with new programs and policies. it's better to use marginal cost than average cost. You're going to produce more accurate, more reliable cost-benefit results. There are a couple of ways to estimate marginal costs, and depending on the resources, the time, the organization you work for, pick one that's right for you. And like Chris mentioned earlier, it's really important to work with government staff to develop those marginal cost estimates and to build relationship. This will really ensure that the data that you're using is accurate and that your results are reliable. Now, we've reached the section on questions. Anybody have any questions?
We have a couple that have come in. First, I want to address just one question on where to get more information on regression analysis. And we'd like to point you to the Washington State Institute for Public Policy, who has done a lot of tremendous work using regression analysis to measure these costs, and is probably your best resource. So if you go to wisipp.wa.gov, that's wsipp.wa.gov, they have an entire section of their website that's devoted to cost-benefit analysis. And they, a few months ago, put out a report in August of 2010 that reviewed their cost-benefit model for corrections. And we encourage you to take a look at that.
Okay, so that about concludes this webinar. We're just going to spend a couple of minutes wrapping everything up. What we hope you've learned from today's webinar is the difference between marginal and average costs, why marginal costs are necessary in a credible cost-benefit analysis, and 5 practical methods to estimate those marginal costs. A couple of points on follow-up. So when you log off this webinar, please complete the evaluation form. This will help us improve our future webinars. Also, to receive information, notifications about upcoming webinars and other events, please visit the Cost-Benefit Knowledge Bank and Criminal Justice website at www.cbkb.org, where you can also subscribe for a newsletter to receive updates from CBKB. Also, please follow us on Twitter. Our username is CBKBank, and we frequently use Twitter to share information about cost-effective practices in criminal justice and also information on doing cost-benefit analysis and other economic assessments in the field. The next webinar will take place on March 24th and will feature Elizabeth Drake from the Washington Institute, and she will discuss the role of evaluation in cost-benefit analysis. We wanted to thank again our funder, the Bureau of Justice Systems, which supported this webinar and future webinars and other elements of CBKB. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to contact me or Chris. Our contact information should appear on your screen. Thank you, and have a great day.